I'm going to pose, if we have time, 2 questions. I'll start, or 2 sort of leading questions, and we'll leave time for questions from you in the last third of this hour. So this is a Palestine Literature Festival, right? And we can't talk about exile without talking or bringing up Edward Said, whose essay on exile continues to resonate. Among his many insights, he writes, "Exiles live with a terminal loss. Exile is irremediably secular and unbearably historical. It is produced by human beings for other human beings. And that, like death, but without death's ultimate mercy, it has torn millions of people from the nourishment of tradition, family, and geography." With that in mind, let me pose for each of you to talk to us about the ways in which exile is integral to your literary work. It is perhaps as an external phenomenon, one that affects you psychologically as you write, or perhaps more directly related to the structure of the narratives that you tell. So whoever would like to go first, I'd pose that question to talk about. Thank you.
So can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Mic's on.
Right up here.
Yeah. 1 second. Hello? Yeah. So I guess I'll start maybe by contextualizing my own experience with exile or uprootedness within my family history. And so my maternal grandparents are from Palestine, from Nazareth and Haifa. In 1948, they were expelled and they moved to Beirut. My father was born in Beirut, and during the Lebanese Civil War, he also had to leave because of his student activism for Palestinian liberation. So he was exiled to Baghdad. He met my mother there, but only a few years later, they had to leave again due to my father's Palestinian background. And they moved to Kuwait, and that's where they had me a few years after that. Iraq invaded Kuwait, and my family were forced to move again. And this continued really for the rest of our lives, from Kuwait to Cyprus to Jordan, back to Kuwait, to the UAE, and now my family are in Lebanon, I live in Europe. And my point in kind of contextualizing this is, it's a reminder that for many Palestinians, exile is not just a single thing that has happened, but it's a continuous part of our existence, and my family story is part of that. There's a long history of being uprooted and being exiled from various contexts and situations. And the Nakba of 1948 that uprooted my grandparents was really only the beginning of our story of exile. And because of, by virtue of my background, and my sense of home has always been fraught, always containing an asterisk of sorts. There's never been a definitive statement about where I'm from. And I think this was also amplified by my own sexuality, growing up gay in the region. When you are socialized to think of your desires as abject or shameful or wrong, that will also contribute to a certain type of estrangement or exile. And this is an exile from your sense of self, an exile from your body, your desires. And that has also informed my sense of uprootedness and of being outside of things. So, in a way, this sense of estrangement or uprootedness is really the space where I think at this point I feel the most comfortable. And I think maybe that's why I turned to writing somehow. And I think in much of my writing, I tend to be drawn to characters who are exiled or estranged in different ways, whether from their countries, their communities, their sense of self, or even their desires. And these characters are in some way trying to return to something, even if they cannot articulate what it is exactly that they're returning to. And even if this thing that they're trying to return to doesn't exist and may never have actually existed. And I find that really interesting, and I find characters who are grappling with this to be very interesting to me as a writer. So when I think of exile, I think about this very multifaceted idea of exile from family, uprootedness from country, but also estrangement from your own sense of self and your own identity and your own body. And I'm particularly interested in how these different forms of exile interact with each other. So how does our history of being uprooted affect family dynamics? How does our sense of being estranged for our body and our desires impact the way that we are in community, or the way that we relate to friendships or lovers or that sort of thing? So I guess that's kind of my entry point and my interest when it comes to the topic of exile stuff.
My father also was, my father's family is Palestinian. My mother identifies and really was just sort of grown up knowing herself to be and understanding herself to be Lebanese because they got the passports. And my parents met and married in Kuwait. So similar to you, it's like the first displacement really just kind of got the ball rolling and wasn't, you know, in some ways, I don't even know. There is something really interesting about this idea of becoming most comfortable in states of like displacement and exile. And I'm a psychologist, like you mentioned, and I'm very interested in the ways that people who undergo erasure learn to erase themselves. And there's like a really high rate among certain marginalized identities of certain disorders. And one of them are eating disorders. And I'm so interested in that idea of like how do we make ourselves disappear and how do we make ourselves smaller. And so I'm somebody that dealt with anorexia when I was younger. I'm somebody that dealt with a lot of substance use when I was younger. And I think that's been that impulse of sort of, if not having displacement kind of enacted upon me by the outside world, enacting it from the inside out, has, I think, been sublimated, and now it's kind of more of a creative endeavor, and I write characters that are really fucked up instead of bringing up. But there's a fair amount of, like, even the characters, there's a restlessness that I think, and there's two things happening, I think, at once in a lot of the art that I'm attracted to and that I feel driven to make, which is there is a simultaneous restlessness and like kind of non-stop like momentum to sit and so that when things are quiet, you find ways to sort of stir them up. But at the same time, you do feel like there's this genuine urge towards a return to something, you know, and a search for something. And there's this kind of like lifelong searching and yearning and longing that becomes in and of itself almost like removed from the original thing that one was yearning for. There's a lot of interesting writing on this about like what is it to really return, and what is it to return to a place that you may have never even had access to. Does that then become a return of imagination? Does it become a return of language? And so I would say for me, it's the idea of exile is so difficult to even extract when I think about my work or how I place myself in the world or how the world sees or places me. It has become kind of just so indelible in my identity and the way that I understand things. But yeah, there's something about these things of like you seek things to return to one way or another when you've experienced displacement. And those things can be adaptive, and they can be things that ultimately are in the service of the kind of life you want to lead and the kind of community you want to belong in, or they're not. But that urge to be like kind of returning to sort of the either the crime scene or the scene of like, you know, or the side of healing is I think something we play out throughout our lives, and I'm really interested in that, like literature and film.
Such beautiful insights already. I feel like there's a very, well, first of all, my work is obviously very concerned with the experience of exile, the experience of diaspora Palestinians in different ways. My first novel is centered around a man who has a kind of reverse yearning. He yearns for France instead of Palestine, but it's a kind of figure in a way for yearning for time and place that has been lost. And this naturally, as with other speakers, is born out of my own experience growing up in an immigrant family and observing certain kinds of psychological traits and behaviours around me, as well as experiencing certain kinds of alienation and estrangement that as a child I didn't have the language for. I'm really interested in what Hala says about repetition, in that I find myself an extremely restless person, which is something I, to be TMI, I'm wrestling with, and that I keep moving countries. So I feel like I'm also carrying this kind of restlessness in myself, which I still haven't worked out. But I do feel that there is a very strong link between this condition and the novel as a form. The novel is a kind of homeless form. It's a form that's searching. So it feels very natural to me to explore these themes through the novel. And in that essay by Saleem that Alexa began with, he says that a very high number of exiles are sort of remarkable that they tend to be novelists, chess players, political activists, and all the third one. But these are professions that require mobility and skill, and rather than attachment to material objects and material places. And I find that quite interesting to think about and try to reflect upon as well in my own life. I think that there is also a very interesting relationship between exilic experiences and Palestinian nationalism, which is a very interesting kind of nationalism. So much of the national movement has historically been conducted outside of Palestine. There are different ways also that Palestinians living within historic Palestine are themselves experiencing forms of exile. There's also a strange way in which in my experience, Palestinians living in historic Palestine can sometimes be a little bewildered by the way in which Palestinians in diaspora express their feelings about Palestine, which is often attachment to certain kinds of tropes, certain kinds of images, which are really an expression for a longing for a time as well as for a place. And that gap is something I'm really interested in, and again, that I explore in my work. I'll leave it there. Pass to Sahar.
I want to first say that I've just been fangirling here the last 2 days, and Isabella asked me for a marker, so I'm going to keep that one forever. I'm just so honored to be on this panel with these other amazing writers, and thank you, Palestine Writes, for inviting me. There were so many other panels today and even yesterday that had me thinking about this one, but I want to first start with before coming here, I'm a high school teacher. I had 2 administrators call me down to their office to ask me about this festival. And I thought this is already approved. In fact, you're not paying a dime, which I also very much appreciate. So for about 2 days, I can't even eat because I feel like I'm going to need to go in. I'm going to have to defend myself. I had so many articles ready, things to pull up. And I had to also think about who else, so not just the Palestinian writers, but who else is on, who are the marquee speakers that might allow me to go. So in this meeting, I think that they could just see my face, and I had to stop and say, I'm just having such a visceral reaction to 2 administrators calling me down. They just wanted to know how many other conferences I wanted to go to because they need subs. I actually had burst into tears, seriously. And they both were incredibly apologetic because they didn't realize what I was coming with. And so when you were talking, Hannah, about trauma, I just think about how much I've carried as a human being, and how privileged I am that I get to write about it. And so the next thing I want to talk about, and this will kind of contextualize how I'm thinking about immigrant and exile writing. I had someone after a reading of The Beauty of Your Face say to me, I thought it was going to be a book about Palestine. Yeah. And so this has been kind of my existential I think, crisis is what does it mean to be a Palestinian writer and to write about Palestine? What does it mean to be a good writer? So for me, it's this, and I think maybe Rita Dove talked about this, the hyphenated writer. It's this double burden of not just having to represent, but having to do basically a fucking good job, right? Because otherwise they're gonna come after that, right, in the craft. And so this is what I struggle with. So when I talk to an editor about this upcoming novel, she says to me, it can't just be about Palestine. So imagine these are the polarities that I'm dealing with. But I have to say, I appreciated what the editor said because she was talking about craft and all the things that I wanted to put in this one book because it is my responsibility because our stories are so limited, right? I had to do it right. I had to do it right. And I was thinking the same thing with Muslim representation in The Beauty of Your Face. And that's who I write for. So I'm glad that we can talk about, what it means to us. But I think this morning's panel made me think about with Maurice and Susan, that we should also have spaces to talk about craft. And, what does it mean to write in a particular form? Why is this a particular, beautiful piece of writing and whatnot? And I think those spaces are still, being cultivated. My parents are from the West Bank, Firat and the Khalil. So I'm Madaniya, married a Fattahi. And both of them, I love this, you were talking about this wanting to go to France, and that was the desire. Same thing with my parents. My father made his business here, as I think many of my counterparts who I met when I lived in Palestine. It was this idea of we're gonna make money here, and then we're gonna raise our children in Palestine, inshallah. And they did. So I lived there from 83 to 88. We came back when the Intifada shut down our schools, and that's privilege. And so for me, I'm writing from that point of view of still having your land. So mine are not the 48, mine are not even 67. Mine are the ones who have two, countries that have both benefited them. And I think for me, I feel quite grateful because I can also talk about, and someone on another panel said this, Palestine being the place of abundance. So it's not always just about strife and occupation and violence. Because my other problem is how much am I normalizing that violence and trauma when I want to create characters who also experience joy and love and creativity and art. And that's what I'm having to negotiate every single time I sit down to write. And I'm happy for it. This is not complaining. This is saying, again, I'm sitting in a place of privilege, and I'm pretty fortunate. The last thing that I want to say is more about my own identity than being the daughter of immigrants. For me, it felt like a sort of double displacement because America wouldn't take me, but then I couldn't celebrate being Palestinian, so that was instantly erased. And I always envied other people of color because they very much still wore their culture, in their daily lives. And I didn't. In fact, it was always tell them you're from Jerusalem, tell them you're from Jordan. And I only in my adult life was I even reading Palestinian poetry and novels. So I never got that. And now I'm the only person in my department who's constantly having to introduce not even just Palestinian writers, but BIPOC and beyond. So I always felt like we lacked the heroics. We didn't have those hero kind of stories, and that's kind of what my new character is dealing with. But I realize it's up to me to kind of reveal, or maybe re-reveal, because I'm not the only one, I'm not the originator, but all of that joy, that beauty, all of the abundance, that comes out of Palestine, for sure.
Well, thank you, everyone, for your responses, and they intertwine and are individual, and the follow-up questions, sort of, you already responded to them in a way through your discussions of exile, rootlessness. And so, Sahar, you brought up craft, and I think it would be interesting to hear from all of you about craft and how perhaps the uprootedness, this sense of unbelonging, perhaps, that many of you talk about or touch on, but at the same time have connection to a place, one of you mentioned, I don't recall, like the place where it's not yours to hold on to perhaps bring out publicly all the time, or maybe now you're finding that you can or want to. So perhaps can you make a connection between that sense of uprootedness, unbelonging, and the craft of writing? Does that make sense? Thank you.
Can you hear me? No? Yes? So what's your opinion? Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, it has a lot to do with writing in different genres. I think that I feel very restless and constrained if I feel like I can only do one thing. And that's true, honestly, across different artistic mediums too. But I think, the best way for me to get out of the slump with a poetry collection is to start working on an essay. The best way to sort of negotiate feeling stagnant in the novel is to start working on some poems. And I feel very lucky to be able to kind of move in and out of those different genres. And I think the more I do move in and out of them, the more I feel how artificially constructed borders they are. I don't really, I don't actually know anymore what the difference is between a memoir and a novel or an essay. I don't know. I think it just is something that we call it, and then the machines that we market it as well. So I think for me, there's a fair amount of, in terms of craft, just kind of moving among different ways of telling a story and really letting the story decide what form it's going to take. And then also, I think on a more logistical level, I can't control my characters. They're so unruly. And I always start with a vision of what it's going to be, and then I'm just why are you sleeping with this person? It's all what's happening when they start doing things, they start saying it, and I think there's something in that too that feels a really delightful, magical lesson to learn over and over again, that you try to impose a certain order on something, which is, I also think, a traditional trait of the exile and the diaspora, is to both be chaotic and obsessed with order at the same time. And there's just something really lovely about kind of being taught over and over again in writing as in life that it doesn't work that way. It's very humbling, and it's really cool.
Does anybody want to take up?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I remember when I first met my publisher for my first novel, and face to face, and she took me out to lunch, and I was explaining my background, and then I said something along the lines, which is how I was feeling, that I kind of wish I was just from one place, because it would just make things so much easier. I would just feel an authority to be able to write from one position. And she was kind of like this rich European woman, and she kind of looked at me and she goes, "Oh, please." That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. She said, "You're sitting on a well." And she's right, and that's kind of how I've been approaching my writing, which is that, as difficult as it is sometimes to have this history of displacement and to feel like you don't entirely belong in any single place, I think it's also allowed me a certain level of richness to be able to inhabit these different worlds. And as it relates to Palestine, because we're in Palestine, right? Palestine is featured much more in my nonfiction than it has in my fiction. And the link is really with my grandmother, who I was very close to growing up, and I would hear a lot about Palestine through her. And side note, she passed away 11 months ago, and she was the last person in our family who directly experienced the Nakba. So grieving her was also grieving a certain connection to Palestine. And I think being here in the last 24 hours has been really nice, because I just feel like this connection has kind of been renewed in some way, and I feel like she's here with us, and that's been really nice. But anyway, but I think also when I have been writing fiction about Palestine, I've really been interested in kind of imagining new ways of conceptualizing our predicaments. And I think the opportunity to write a sci-fi story really allowed me to kind of imagine the different challenges that we're dealing with as a community in a whole new genre, in a whole new way. And I was just commissioned to write a superhero story about a Palestinian superhero. And that has also been really fun. So I think for me, when it comes to Palestine, I think I'm just trying to kind of see how we can kind of explore ourselves in these new genres that might, when we're oftentimes pushed towards realism, to kind of break out of that prison in some way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's really, thank you for sharing that. Sahar?
So I love this question, as I said earlier. When I wrote The Beauty of Your Face, the plot was pretty immediate. So that's inspired by the 3 hate murders of Saleem, her husband and her sister, in cold blood by their white neighbor. So it was very easy to work around that, because I still consider myself a short story writer. And if people are wondering, what does she write about Palestine? I feel like they would see that very clearly, maybe. And moving forward, I'm working on a short story collection that was inspired by the fact of the man. So her deputies cohort just blew my mind away. And so with this other project, I started with, I think, maybe just exploring the condition of occupation. And that then became problematic, because if I'm going to write a novel, there has to be something happening in the project. Well, I think there's a lot happening, but it's not this sort of the traditional architecture. So my editor said there's no connective tissue. So I've been maybe doing something that was more linked, I guess. So I've learned a lot, as I mentioned earlier, just about that balance of, producing something aesthetically and it being something that sort of reflects my truth about being an observer, being the daughter of immigrants and now having daughters who are, the daughters of immigrants. And, I just hope it's engaging. I hope it rings true, but again, I don't know that those concerns ever immediately dissolve, for me.
I'm still sort of thinking through it, but this idea that being a resource, these experiences being actually something, a big well to sit on, at the same time that they're deeply uncomfortable, that exile is deeply uncomfortable and can be terrible to experience, but there's a possibility that such a positionality, such an experience provides you with extraordinary insights because you are at the edges of things and you can move between positions, you can see things with certain clarity that those who are deeply rooted and embedded and very comfortable cannot see. And that's something I think that's helpful to bear in mind. I used a word last night by accident, the word agon, which I went home and checked, is that actually a word? It is a word, it's a Greek word that means contest or tussle. And it was, protagonist and antagonist is agon in the middle. Those are the 2 sides that are in contest with each other. And it was a word that was used in ancient Greek drama and also in ancient Greek sporting events. And there's a version also in political philosophy of agonistic pluralism. It's a certain kind of pluralism that is very beneficial when you have a tussle between perspectives, something good comes out of it. And I feel like that's something that's helpful to bear in mind, even as its emotional manifestation is agony. That's also based on agon. So I think that we can keep those multiple things in mind. It's a way of thinking about how experiences that are deeply painful, deeply uncomfortable and alienating can also be a resource. And how also our multiplicity and our diversity of experience is also our power.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for indulging in my questions, and perhaps you have some questions here. I see your hand up immediately back there, and I'll do my best to be as just as possible.
Hi. This question came to me, and kind of not about your identity at all, and we're all very players. So I wonder how you balance what's truly personal and how you decide what you're going to share, and how you censor yourself, if you care to share.
You know what, well, I think I would start by saying, and this came up in the session this morning, that some people automatically assume that the fictitious characters are actually me and my family, and I think a lot of my writers get that. So it's that kind of, someone coined trauma porn, I think that was the term, and how much, white audience will consume that. For me, it's personal, but even if it is rooted in stories and experience, for me, fiction has always felt like this wonderful buffer too. And I think we all have a memoir in us, but for me personally, I guess it's not a huge issue. Yeah, but I just wanted to point out that people go to that first, if that's what you mean by personal, and or biographical. Yeah.
I mean, what of your inside do you sometimes hesitate to share?
I mean, all writing is revealing and concealing in different ways. Even something that's like supposedly autofictional is highly constructed. And I think it's important to give writers credit of control over their material. Yeah. Even when they're saying, this is my experience, that's not something they just wrote down. My own life, or my own writing life, I like to pull from everything. So I love this kind of observational. I make writing, which is a very solitary act, actually very social. I interview people a lot, I do a lot of research, I try and listen, a lot of writing is listening. But inevitably, of course, my own experiences are also part of my palette. It's another resource to draw on that's very close by. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but I don't really feel an anxiety about exposure because I don't really think about it that way. My own self melts away, and it's just what's available to use.
Or should we take a question? Yeah. Okay. I saw her before, and then how about?
So, my question is from Hala. I assign some classes every semester. They love it. And one topic that we often practice in the clinical psychology is the role of memory when it comes to the characters of those problems. What is it that you want to convey to the reader?
That's it. Yeah, sure.
Yes, so the question is, starting with a very kind of comment that you assign, so how is every semester to your students? And then what is the role as a psychologist, what is the role that memory plays in these characters? First of all, thank you for assigning. And thank you everyone in here who assigns any of our work. It really is just a beautiful thing. So I'll say just on that real quick. So my husband earlier was like, oh, you're going off to the panel, are you nervous? And I was like, what do I have to be nervous about? Name me one room in my life where more people are going to be rooting for me to succeed. So thank you for that. I think memory and trauma is really interesting in that it gets really fragmented. And because trauma is often a disorder of, like, you become unrooted in time. Like that, it's a temporal experience in that one's mind amygdala is experiencing an event as though it is constantly reoccurring, as though it's happening right now, over and over and over and over again. And then so the best way to break that cycle actually often is to move towards the thing safely, again, ideally with therapy or other healing practices, where you move towards the thing that created the pain, but with some sort of resourcing and some sort of scaffolding, and kind of again return to the site of the pain, but ideally with a different perspective. And really, I mean, in my opinion, the core of psychological health is not overcoming. It's not leaving certain things behind. It's integration, and it's like finding ways to live alongside the fact that you have experienced certain things, you have intergenerationally experienced certain things, that's something you have to reckon with. The things my grandparents went through are not, it's not just that I'm just like, okay, I've written a few books and it's over now. Like, I have to explain that to my daughter, who is half Palestinian, half white. Like, I have to find a way to explain that to future generations, and for them to also recognize that that's never going to be done. That sort of work. And I think there's something where memory does this really interesting thing where it can serve as a way, I'm trying to think of the best way to put this, like it can end up being a vehicle where we are perpetually lost because we're returning to the same thing without anything new, and we're not bringing anything new of ourselves or anything new of the world around us, any new knowledge of the world around us. And I try to do that with the characters, often by just showing characters that are really stuck in old patterns. I think everyone here has talked about, to a certain extent, in different language, obsessionality, or like really kind of repetitiveness, like Isabella was saying, kind of just the inability to break the pattern. And I think my characters often have that. The other thing is that people will try to shut down memories. And so in Salt Houses in particular, there are characters that just do not speak of Palestine. Once they leave, it becomes an unspeakable topic in their families. And so I think you see that often in like Exile displacement. It's like two extremes, right? There's kind of this like constantly talking about the thing, constantly trying to keep it alive in these different ways, or it's just like, this is so painful, we have to put it away. I know, I feel like I have a lot, but that's
I don't know, how much? Can I ask 2 questions or just one?
Well, how about one? If there are a lot of answers.
Okay, hi, I'm Hala from Georgetown University. I'm a Culp senior. My big question for you is, because you're, I'm guessing each of you are in exile in some shape or form, who or what higher power or who's going to facilitate your eventual return to the homeland? Who's going to do it?
The question, how will we achieve Palestinian liberation?
Think through this question. How do you imagine, or do you imagine that there's a return for you? And if there is a return to a place called home, a place that how might that happen? That makes me so excited. I don't know if everybody heard. Question asking or to think about home, a return home to Palestine and how they think as individuals that may happen for themselves, if they envision that.
Maybe I'll go. I don't know if maybe I'll answer it in the way that you want, but I don't really imagine a realistic return for me back to Palestine. And for me, that's okay. And the reason I say that is because I'm half Palestinian. My mother's Iraqi, German. I grew up in many different countries. And for me, Palestine is something that my relationship to Palestine is, the last time I was there was when I was 8 or 9. It's a very familial relationship. It's a very metaphorical relationship. It's not a very physical relationship. And I think that also the way that I personally relate to Palestine is really as that start of that journey of uprootedness and exile. And I don't know, realistically speaking, having lived in different countries, if a return to Palestine would be a return to home for me. It would probably be the easy answer to say yes, it would be, right? I would go back and I would smell the jasmine and all of that stuff. But practically speaking, would it be? And I think for me, that tension is what I'm interested in exploring in my literature, right? Is that there's no easy answer to this question of return. There's no happy ending. There's complexity and nuance.
Okay, I saw your hand and your hand, and then I haven't looked over here. So we'll get these 3 questions. Maybe we'll just take them all together and then people can respond as they.
My question is to Hala. Hala, I love your poetry so much, and I was wondering how much of it would you want the reader to read as autobiographical?
Hi, my question is for everyone. So as people in the diaspora, as you guys already discussed, that comes with a lot of pain, but then also a lot of privilege. And I'm so happy to see that there's a lot of awareness on this panel about privilege. I really respect that. And so I'm just thinking about the ways, how can we reframe privilege as responsibility for locals in Palestine who do not have that privilege?
Hi, I just have a more logistical writing question. When you're writing your novels, you have these like main scenes that move the story forward, right? But what I always think about and struggle with a little bit in my own writing is the smaller scenes. So like Hala, Arsenicity, all-time favorite novel. I've read it many times. But never seen myself so much in any piece of literature. It's incredible. But I think of the smaller scenes like Mazna and Idris and Zakaria having lunch or dinner at the cat, right? Like these really small scenes that kind of seem insignificant, but they mean something to the story and they move the story forward. So for all of you, as you're in that creative writing process, how do you think about those smaller scenes that contribute to moving the story forward? How does your imagination take you there?
So I'll go back to this. So I think and I think that it's easier for me to do the smaller scenes because it takes me a year and a half to finish any story, like a verbal story. My dad calls it his wedding. Like we go down little alleyways and he says like all me and my mom and sister. He's like, oh my God. So like I think I just have a brain that actually loves the little moments. And I have a harder time with plot, like bigger plot. So I could live in just like the tiny moments and the little glances, the little conversations and whatever. And my issue is more that I have to pull myself back and think about sort of overarching plot, which maybe isn't a problem. I think I write more character-driven fiction and that's fine. But I think to the point where making there needs to be some like sort of machinery kind of moving the plot forward. And then in terms of the question about I think a fair amount, don't tell my dad, is autobiographical. I do think to bring it back to your question somewhat earlier that like for me, starting to work on a nonfiction project for the first time ever that began as an essay collection and is now turning into a memoir, I'm just like, that is the most stressful experience of my life. And I have tried to back out of this project. I feel like there's a contract. I'm like, do you want a novel instead? They're like, that's not what we bought. And that's not how this industry works. I'm very, like, I think, yes, there's a fair amount of autobiography, but I've been able to hide behind genre and sort of be like kind of sneaky in how I describe it, whereas with something like a memoir, there is nowhere to really hide. And I'm very nervous about that.
I can go with this question, which thank you so much for that question. It was beautifully phrased. It's something I think about all the time. And I do think that the word privilege sometimes gets used in this way that it can be a little virtue signaling or it can be kind of apologetic. and it makes it about you again. You hear me okay? And I think that I think about it as obligation and responsibility, that we do have huge responsibility as Palestinians in the diaspora with freedoms of movement, freedoms of speech, that we need to call upon collectively, and I think we need to be doing more. But thank you for the question. I have nothing really to add except that it's at the forefront of my consciousness and I'm always working through it.
You know, I'm going to add to that too. And I love what you said about privilege being possibly virtue begetting. That's my problem too. I would say personally, I try to elevate the political activism work in my immediate communities, but then also nationally. So if you look at my social media, I'm probably trying to advocate more the news like Diana Abdul and the IMU here, and of course other organizations that might just be humanitarian. But it still feels like I'm playing such a small part, but I'm trying to do my best. And sometimes it's just monetarily. I don't know that I always can get into a demonstration of physical protest anymore. So I'm always very close to it. It's just figuring out how, maybe I can continue to sort of elevate, my good intentions, which pave the road to hell. So, yeah, I agree. Wonderful question.
So I acknowledge and realize that privilege in the United States and all the things that identify me as an individual, but I think that also has a responsibility. That because I have a bigger platform or perhaps a bigger mic, I don't want to say a burden, but it's responsibility to share that, like, even just on my LinkedIn profile, that I have a Palestinian flag next to my name, and that goes a long way. I get random people that say, I just love the fact that you have the flag on LinkedIn, things like that. So do you view that as in that way? And also, when you write, do you write to write, or do you write to market? I'm not talking about the financial aspect of it, but are you writing so that people can pick up a copy of your book? By the way, I love a autograph. Or is it writing to really share the story and therapeutic in a way?
Yeah, I think part of the reason maybe that I have been hesitant to explore Palestine very thoroughly in my fiction, I have Palestinian characters, but to actually set a story in Palestine is the fact that I haven't lived there, and so I don't necessarily feel that I'm best placed to be able to tell that story. But I think for me as an author, I've been active on Palestine for 20 years. I was president of the Palestinian Human Rights Group at my college campus. So the skirmishes that have happened here have given me PTSD of 20 years ago. But it's always been a cause that's central to my heart and something that I always lead with in terms of my politics. I'm a supporter of BDS and I follow BDS. But I think it's also finding that balance between being part of the chorus, but not necessarily kind of overtaking that space, especially as someone who has decided not to make Palestine the focus of my work. It's certainly a focus of my work, but not the focus. So I can't remember what the other question was.
I'll add to that it's like making space for these things, but also making space for other people. You know what I mean? And I think thinking about the ways, if you have a platform or if you have the attention of something as fickle as the publishing industry for as however long we do, I think it is our responsibility to facilitate introductions between emerging writers, or to mentor, or to teach in different ways, or to be available to folks in that way. Because I think that's a really here's the thing. Your question, the way I hear it, is asking about scarcity of abundance. In terms of do you write for market or do you write because you're inspired? like I think that the publishing industry, like many industries, want people who belong to certain marginalized oppressed identities to feel like there's not enough space in the room, right? There can be one of us every season, maybe, you know, so do well with your platform, right? Like do it, be good, do whatever. And I think like that's not correct. And I think the market itself has been like, I mean, there's a really beautiful essay by Mary Jane Howard which talks about this, where it's like, that's also not true even from a business perspective, right? Like, that people are hungry for these stories and they will pay for them. If we're gonna look at it from purely just like gross perspective, capitalist perspective. So I think like there's something about taking a breath and remembering that there's enough. Like I think so much starts with that. So much starts with like orienting ourselves towards abundance, even though we're told there's not. And I think then that impacts the ways we interact with each other on all of these different levels. Like that's what a legacy is. You know, it's sure maybe it's going to be the books you write, but it's really going to be the ways you spent time. You know what I mean? Like for the communities you built, the ways you contributed to them, the ways you upheld other people, who you stood up for, who you came to whose defense, like who comes to your defense. Like I think there's something in that I think it's a trap and it's really easy to get sucked into it. And the best way not to is for us to keep reminding ourselves